Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce, Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into, to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we go to first? Got a number of different topics to talk about. Well, I did promise to talk about the Washington Post article that came out, when was this now? It's December the 4th, so 4 days ago. This was a kind of an analysis of the counter-offensive, looking at what the Ukrainians did and didn't do, and kind of laying the blame at the Ukrainians to a large degree. And people like Phillips O'Brien, a kind of historian of war, has written a Substack, but other people have analysed this article and decided it really skirted round some of the key issues, was a little bit disingenuous, and basically look to be getting allies off the hook for what happened in Ukraine. So rather than go through the Washington Post article, I am actually just going to go through Phillips O'Brien's Substack just as a way of accessing this. But obviously, go and read the original, In Ukraine, a War of Incremental Gains as Counteroffensive Stalls. Phillips O'Brien said on Twitter, read the Washington Post story on the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Appalling on many levels. Why US sources would decide to knife Ukraine in the back entirely disingenuously as Ukraine is fighting for its life is contemptible. The story also glosses over air power and ATACMS. Wrote a Substack update for everyone where I engage with only some of the problems. We'll write more this weekend. So this is the first of a couple to look at this. So we'll just look at a couple of the main problems with the article, and in fact with some of the narrative you might hear touted out there. All of these points you will know very well. This is stuff I've been talking about a great deal over the last however long. So he titles this, "The Blame Ukraine Narrative Has Arrived in Full," and he takes a look at the Washington Post article, mentions some of it, talks about, he excerpts some of it, talks about where he predicted articles like that coming out before they came out. Sort of expect to see, as he says, the narrative is coming, expect to see this narrative. And then lo and behold, it actually happened. But just the kind of summary of the main points he wants to look at in this particular Substack is, if this article is anything to go by, the blame Ukraine narrative is even worse than expected. The article included all the canards that anonymous sources have been letting out here and there for a while. Ukraine was too casualty averse. Ukraine did not use Western equipment properly. Ukraine did not stick with the offensive long enough. Ukrainian soldiers weren't well prepared by their own side. And on the other hand, we are told that Pentagon wargamers, by the way, these are the same people that had Kiev falling in 2 days, or Russia seizing the Baltic states against all of NATO in 24 hours, did some games and were sure Ukraine would triumph. He just goes, he's really damning. So the article is a disgrace and reveals how little people have learned from this war, how low the US has sunk as a friend and ally, at least from these sources. So that's not just in general, that's, you know, those sources that the article uses. So what does the article not do? So first, it passes over the lack of Ukrainian air power beyond one quick mention. It's fascinating how this line was thrown in, and then afterwards the anonymous sources continue to say the lack of a breakthrough was Ukraine's fault. Really, you can stop at this. Well, this and actually point number 2, really, I think for me, are just supremely important. No, actually, point number 3, all those 3. All the 3 points he mentions are really the reasons why the counteroffensive kind of stalled. Although you can also add in that dilemma I've talked about, which is the longer well, actually, that is part 3. Well, I'll wait for that. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. So this idea that NATO and allies would expect Ukraine to prosecute a counteroffensive without getting even air advantage, let alone air superiority, let alone air supremacy, is crazy. Like, the US have done that 3 times before in their history, and this is going back to the 1940s, and it wasn't cool then, and they had a tough time of it. Air superiority is an absolute must in order for any NATO army to do offensive maneuvers. We know this, yet we know they didn't have that, partly because they weren't provided with the weapons in order to get that right from the beginning. And it's just been this attritional grind you're having to do because you don't have air superiority. So, that, as I say, that's like a huge point. You can't just put this throwaway sentence. This is a Washington Post sentence. If this were the United States or NATO, the operation also would have included devastating air power to weaken the enemy and protect troops on the ground. But the Ukrainians would have to make do with little or none. And that's all it says about that. Well, no, actually, the whole article should be premised on the fact that they don't have air superiority, and that makes everything else almost impossible. Just, beggars belief. Anyway, the second point that he makes is that the Ukrainians understood this war better than we did. One of the shocking parts of the story is the fact that US training originally did not include much drone interaction because US did not include them in the curriculum. It took the Ukrainians to add them to the training over US objections. So the quote from the article is, some of the Ukrainian soldiers thought the American trainers didn't grasp the scale of the conflict against a more powerful enemy. Quote, the presence of a huge number of drones, fortifications, minefields and so on were not taken into account, said a soldier in the 47th with the call sign Joker. Ukrainian soldiers brought their own drones to help with their skills, he said, but trainers initially rebuffed the request to integrate them because the training programs were predetermined. Drone use was later added following Ukrainian feedback, a US official said. Like, honestly, air superiority issue, but then the presence of a huge number of drones, fortifications, minefields, and so on were not taken into account. So if you're doing training for a counter-offensive that doesn't take into account drones, fortifications, minefields, and so on, the training is not worth it. It's just not worth it. I don't know how you can begin to blame the Ukrainians for all of this, given all of those situations. We're going to help you. We're going to provide weapons for you. We're going to provide training for you. We're going to, facilitate you winning this thing. Like, we need Ukraine to win this thing. That's the kind of understanding from allies, isn't it? We need you to win this thing, so let's give you everything you need to win this, which is training that doesn't take into account fortifications, minefields, and drones. We're going to give you not the equipment to get air superiority. And then this third point, we didn't actually give Ukraine what it asked for, either enough ground equipment or the desperately needed ranged weaponry such as ATACMS that the Ukrainians have been asking for since early 2022. The Section 9 ATACMS is particularly disingenuous. The final key decision, this is a quote from the Washington Post article, on weapons transfers came in September when the administration agreed to provide a variant of the Army tactical missile system known as ATACMS. The missiles were not the deep strike variant Kiev had requested, with the United States instead opting for a shorter range weapon that drops cluster submunitions, which I don't actually mind too much. I think that's a useful form of weaponry. While useful, Ukrainian officials said neither the ATACMS launchers nor the cluster weapons have broken the battlefield deadlock. Well, no, because it happened at the end of the counteroffensive. So if we go back to my kind of role play there, which is like, okay, so we're going to give you training that's not adequate for the situation you're in. We're not going to, and I want to talk about drones separately in a second, and we are not going to allow you to have the equipment in order to get air superiority. And then we are going to give you the equipment that you really asked for, but we're going to give it at the end of the counteroffensive. So the ATACMS will give you at the end of the counteroffensive. And look, in the first night of using them, you destroyed 2 air bases. That was all about that air superiority, wasn't it? Oh, yeah, I see. And those helicopters were hammering your equipment. So when you lost all that equipment at the beginning, that was partly due to getting stuck on minefields and then it being hammered, which you hadn't been trained for, and then being hammered by the aircraft. Those low-flying helicopters coming in with their longer-ranged ATGMs on board and hammering your vehicles. Those helicopters that would have been taken out had we given you ATACMS before. So the whole thing is framed incorrectly as far as the Washington Post is concerned, and this could have all been avoided. Now, if we go back to the beginning of the counteroffensive, the Ukrainians were aiming to do the counteroffensive at the beginning of spring. Right, that's what was being touted back in 2022, right? And then the beginning of spring came, and they went, no, we can't do it because they didn't have the equipment and they hadn't been finished being trained. So it's not to like blame the hand that feeds them, right? But if we are serious about helping Ukraine, that should be serious about helping them to win as soon as possible and as effectively as possible and as efficiently as possible. But instead, we've given them a little bit of stuff, or a lot of stuff, but here, then there, and then after they've asked for it, after we realise the red lines aren't meaningful at all, and after they've really needed those things. So what that meant is that Zelensky said, well, we're delayed in the counteroffensive. He said that. And the counteroffensive started 3 months overdue. And even then, they didn't have the Abrams tanks, main battle tanks, till September. They didn't have ATACMS till the end of the counteroffensive. They didn't have all sorts of stuff that they needed prior to that. And yet, we're kind of, this article appears to be blaming the Ukrainians for the failed counteroffensive. As I said, it's not trying to have a go at the hand that feeds them, but it is like, well, what are we trying to do? Like, we're either going to help them to win or not. Don't do it half-heartedly. And the other thing is drones, and I don't think if they're not being trained on drones or integrating drone warfare into maneuvers training in the way that the Ukrainians are used to, because at the end of the day, like, NATO trainers probably don't have any real life experience of using drones in the way that Ukraine and Russia are using drones on a battlefield and combining them together with all different aspects of maneuvers warfare. So if they've got absolutely no experience of that, then they can't train the Ukrainians on that. So the Ukrainians go to training and say, well, we're not dealing with minefields, we're not dealing with fortifications in the way that we're experiencing over there, and we're not dealing with drones, and we're having to bring some of our own drones to get used to using them, but there's no provision of training for that. And in other words, that training is not fit for purpose, it's outdated. Now, it's great they're getting some training, there'll be great basic training that was taking place, but in terms of what was really needed for the Ukrainians, it's been consistently criticized or stated that they just didn't get the training they needed. Just a real shame there. So I think articles like this, the insinuation here is articles like this are to get Western, particular people, military personnel, personalities off the hook for it going badly, and say, well, hey, it wasn't us, it was the Ukrainians. We gave them everything. Well, we didn't give them everything they needed, and we didn't give what we did give them on the time frame that they needed them to prosecute a successful counteroffensive. And they had to delay and delay and delay, and all that time they delayed, the Russians were laying minefields and building fortifications and getting more helicopters in place. So it's a difficult one. Talking about helicopters, Tatarigami here has written a thread while public attention was on the airfields in Luhansk and Berdyansk. So these are the two airfields that were taken out with ATACMS as soon as they arrived. Russians set up helicopter bases and FARPs, those are forward refueling sort of positions, where instead of having a full air base, you'd fly from your full air base, which is further back because it's safer, and then you'd touch down, refuel, and then take off and carry and do your stuff. So rather than house a helicopter there permanently. This was initially exclusive to paid subscribers, but now releasing it, especially in light of the recent SBU strike in the region. Okay, so this is in Kherson Oblast. This particular base, you can see that satellite imagery allows people to count out helicopters and find out where things are. So this is just north of Crimea, along the kind of, I wonder if that's along the Helichesk, the Arabat Spit that joins Helichesk to Crimea there. In November, as Ukrainian forces advanced towards Kherson, the Russian military opted to move their helicopters from the Chaplinka aerodrome to more secure inland locations, including a fenced beach resort in Arabat Spit near Crimea. So if you remember, so he's talking about Chaplinka here. So where's that? Here it is. So Chaplinka is there. So What happened is there was Chornobivka. I don't know if you remember this. Let's remind you. So Chornobivka is there, just outside of Kherson, and the Ukrainians were relatively close, pretty much along this line there, give or take. So the Ukrainians were over here, and they were routinely hammering Chornobivka airports. And there was a great meme on Twitter which had the airport getting blown up, a sort of CGI version of the airport getting blown up on this disc, and then rotating it, all the things falling off, and then coming back with all the things back on, and then it got bombed again, and it just carried on going over, because it turned out, I think, was it something like 13 times Chornobivka was hit, and yet the Russians still kept equipment there, helicopters there, and whatnot. Anyway, eventually, with the Kherson counter-offensive taking place, they moved that equipment from Chornobivka back to Chaplinka. The problem is, of course, HIMARS could still hit Chaplinka. If we look at how far that is about 80 kilometers from somewhere where you'd release a HIMARS, a fairly safe HIMARS release. So that's well within HIMARS range. So they moved it back to Chaplinka. Then Chaplinka started getting hit by HIMARS. So they moved these airframes elsewhere. And this is what Tatrugami's talking about here. So says that in November, as Ukrainian forces advanced towards Kherson, the Russian military opted to move their helicopters from the Chaplinka aerodrome to more secure inland locations, including the one on the Arabat Spit. So I know I'm just repeating myself, it just gives you an idea of where we're talking about. And this is one that's somewhere around here. They have an air base. And of course, you know, without ATACMS, that becomes difficult to strike because realistically it is... In fact, even with the ATACMS they have now, that is, which have 150 kilometer range, that is broadly out. That is out of range. So, yeah, that's a much safer place for their aircraft to be. In this image, 20 helicopter pads are visible. Some occupied by Russian helicopters like Mi-24, Mi-8, K-52, and possibly Mi-28s. Notably, the site is within the beach resort Volna, enclosed by a fence. Further analysis of the 2021 imagery shows no helicopter pads at this location, hinting at rapid efforts to establish an ad hoc helicopter base conveniently placed among beach resorts and hotels, potentially serving as accommodations for their pilots. Russians didn't use this location during the early stages of the war. Historical imagery analysis indicates that the construction commenced around October 2022, so this was coinciding with the Kherson offensive. This effort was probably aimed at relocating from Chaplinka in Kherson Oblast. And he sort of almost comes to a finish here. The evacuation and relocation of the Chaplinka airbase, as previously mentioned, exemplify the Russian necessity to establish new concealed locations due to concerns about potential targeting, given the growing range of Ukrainian weaponry. This pattern will continue. So C2 areas, command and control, radar control area, primary flight line, and fueling area. So, you know, this is open source intelligence being able to work all of this out. So imagine how much information, you know, actual military intelligence sources have. Simultaneously, it must be acknowledged that the quality and frequency of concealment measures have notably improved compared to 2022. The Russians have been notably successful in concealing some of their new helicopter sites and command centers for a while. And the frustration here is that you've got some dude, I don't know, Tatrugami, is he a reservist or something, on Twitter, showing you very clearly where Russian helicopter bases are. And it kind of goes back to this point from Phillips O'Brien, that if they had the right equipment, you could destroy those bases. So the some kind of longer ranged ATACMS, the version that's 300 kilometer range, is it, that has fewer submunitions in place. It's still a cluster variant, but that should be able to hit that airbase. Now, if they had the correct weapons, Ukraine would be able to do all sorts of damage to the Russians, but we are just unable, unwilling, I don't know, to give weapons to Ukraine when they want them and when they need them. We wait until it's almost too late, and then here you are. Oh yeah, we probably should have given that to you earlier. It's really frustrating. And then when you know, all the stuff going on in Congress and elsewhere, it's like, man, if we could just say, right, here's everything, they could just go around and if they had the right weapons, which wouldn't change, it wouldn't be escalatory. They could hammer every airbase in occupied territories and force the Russians to pull every single one of their airframes out of occupied territories. I'm sure they could, but unfortunately, even though they potentially can, in reality they can't, because they don't have those weapons. And so they're being forced to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. Anyway, who was it? Someone this morning said, it's John Cromwell saying, I'm going to rechristen you Ranty Claus for Christmas. Ranty Claus. I'm pretty ranty at the moment. Interesting Russian diet. This is quite sad to watch this, really, isn't it? You've got a Russian soldier with a spoon, lying, not appearing to want to move too much, cold, spooning snow off the ground in order to consume it. That's his water. He says, relaxingly drinking from a cup of hot tea. To be honest, cold now. That's sad, isn't it? But that's the state of affairs it is for that person, for the Russian army in places. Of course, it's very easy to extrapolate this kind of activity, these conditions across the whole of the army, and then you think, how can you do that? It's dangerous, because then Russia do really well in a particular maneuver, take a bunch of land. How can they do that? They're eating snow off the floor. So these are anecdotes, remember, and that's really important. Right, I'm going to go to a comment from W Bin here. Thank you. And this is something they've mentioned a number of times on my threads over the course of the war. And in fact, I have mentioned this before, but I will mention it again. It's worth reminding ourselves that there's a big question of Russia's membership of the UN, because it is the Russian Federation and not the USSR. So he says here, as long as the original sin hasn't been fixed, more will follow, is a quote from one of the videos. So the original sin being the lie that Russia can incapacitate the UN's primary function of peacekeeping. How can they do that? Well, they sit on as a permanent member on the Security Council. The UN is a world's police force. What do you expect if you violate the UN Charter and empower an unstable terrorist state to shut down the police and give away get-out-of-jail-free cards to buy friends and spread corruption and terrorism? Read this, Jonathan. Please reply with numbers you require proof of. I don't require any proof. I mean, all of this is correct. Please acknowledge this is visible. I'm talking about it. 1. Russia is not the USSR. USSR was a completely separate state member alongside its members, Ukraine and Belarus. 2. Russia has never fulfilled the UN Charter requirements for becoming a member. 3. USSR ceased to exist in 1991, repeatedly declared from the 8th to the 21st of December 1991. 4. Russia formally declared independence on the 16th of December 1991. Kazakhstan was the only member left in the USSR up to the 21st of December. 5. Yeltsin wrote a letter to the UN on the 24th of December 1991 announcing Russia was continuing the USSR memberships. That letter has never been accepted by the UN. 6. There is no provision in the Charter to transfer memberships. 7. In 1992, the UN General Assembly, by Resolution 47-1, confirmed Serbia and Montenegro could not continue Federation of Yugoslavia's membership, even though they had not left and not declared it ceased to exist. Grounds the Federation had ceased to exist. As noted in UNSC Resolution 777 and required by Russia, it was not accepted. In 1971, Republic of China representatives were expelled by 58% resolution of the General Assembly 2758 as unlawfully claiming to continue a permanent membership and veto. It is number 9. It is obvious from 7 and 8 that the UNSC so the UN Security Council has no say in determining the validity of memberships and expelling non-members. That is not within its powers specified in the UN Charter. 10. Conclusion. We have been lied to. Russia is not a successor to the USSR. Its representatives can be expelled by simple majority vote of the General Assembly. No reform is needed. Expulsion cannot be vetoed. Interesting. So why is this not happening? Of course, this is only important or meaningful because this is I guess, a technicality. Call it what you like, but this is only meaningful if someone actually does something about it. Otherwise, it just remains like it doesn't matter that Russia don't have a right to sit on the UN Security Council if everyone treats them as if they do have that right. So the technicality is only important if you do something about that technicality, if you enforce the rules, or if you challenge the rules and do something that sits within those rules. Why is it? So it's kind of an open question, and you guys can try and furnish us with answers here. Why is it that no one has tried to do something about this, has tried to expel Russia from the UN? Why is it that no one has? Would it cause such a ruckus within the UN with neutral members of the UN that it could lead to the undoing of UN and the whole thing would just fall apart? Could that be it? I mean, that might be something I could see. Would you have a bit of a civil war as Russia goes around trying to get the global South to vote on its behalf, and it becomes a bit of a UN civil war? Or are there other reasons? Why is it that Russia is able to sit as a security member, as a permanent seat on the Security Council? Sorry. Why is it they can continue to do that and therefore veto the UN from doing anything meaningful concerning this horrific war in Ukraine, where Russia are the bad guys? They are the aggressors, and they are going against, the whole charter of the UN. Just you said this a number of times, Ben, and I don't disagree with you. This is definitely an avenue to take that hasn't been taken. I remember reading a few articles on this like a year ago or whatever, and I forget where it left me in my conclusions, but I think this should be looked at for sure. However, until it is looked at, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it should matter. It's really important, and this is an avenue that we could go down. But until we go down it, it's just the potential, and Russia will continue to do that, and that's frustrating. I showed you this map this morning. So texty.org.ua publication posted an approximate map of the routes used to attack Ukraine with Shahed drones. First image is this is drones. The second image is our missiles this autumn. And of course, there aren't too many missiles. That's not very many missiles because they've hardly fired any missiles this autumn. I'd love to see that, a map like that at the height of the missile attacks, maybe earlier this year, last year. It would look a lot more like that, or a lot redder, that's for sure. So these are the routes of Shahed drones, and you can see there are two main areas. We've got the air bases back here, Staro-Konstantinov, and also you can see a bit of a concentration down here in the Odessa region, Reni and Ismail on the Danube as well, Odessa too. And I don't know if there's quite a few finishing in the sort of Mykolaiv area, possibly. I don't know if that reaches across to Zaporizhia enough there, but certainly there are other areas. Kryvyi Rih will be in there too. A little bit in Kiev. I think that's Kiev there. So if we go to the map, there's quite a few up there in that northern area as it comes down. So that's Kharkiv, and Kiev, is right over there. So if we go back to that map, so Kiev is not really touched by drones, and that's because, as I said before, the air defenses are just too good in Kiev, and they take out the drones. But this is your main concentration at the back here. Now, if we look at the cruise missiles, and as I said, unfortunately, there just aren't that many. But we can see, a couple down here in the Odessa region. These purple ones, I don't know what that signifies, what these different cruise missiles are, because I can't read that language. But we can see that Kharkiv is hit a little bit, but actually quite a few going up there. So that is Poltava region. So Poltava, then there's probably military bases there that are targets for the Russian missiles. We can see a few of them coming all the way back to these air bases back here, and a couple further away still, possibly some military installations, some factories maybe there. A lot of them generally in the middle here, and that looks to be sort of Kryvyi Rih here, maybe in this kind of area. I don't know. Yeah. I'd love to see that when they start. I mean, goodness me, I don't want the Russians to start hammering Ukraine with their stockpile cruise missiles, but it'd be really interesting to see where they go for. You can imagine they will try to overcome the Kiev areas, but I don't even think that's worthwhile for them to do. If I was Russia, I would get all my cruise missiles at just one or two places and just absolutely hammer those places. If I know exactly where air bases or really important military installations are, I would just overcome those. But hey, it's just my thoughts there. Let me know what you think of those maps. And thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate all your support. Take care, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. It's a weekend tomorrow. Sports matches will be taking place on the Saturday and a Sunday, so I'll be taking one of my boys particularly to those, so I can't guarantee the timing of my content. Nevertheless, it will get out at some point. See you later.